Thanks, Dwight, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to come to this meeting. And I do look forward to the discussion that we can have after I've presented some of these basic ideas about this particular novella that I'm going to present to you. I would also like to point out that this novella, which was written in the 19th century, this is not my primary area of research. I'm actually a medievalist by training, but ever since I came to UT, I've been cross-dressing as a generalist. And this has been part of my generalist scholarly work and work that I have addressed in the classroom. I teach French language, I teach culture and literature at the undergrad and at the grad level. And this particular subject area is very dear to me because it came out of an intersection of teaching and research. And it is emblematic for me of what I think we should be doing as teachers and as scholars. And that is, when we do our research, it is something that should come back into the classroom. And what we learn in the classroom about teaching these works should also inform our research. So that's a little bit of background of how I came to this novella. And the novella in question is Ourika. I want to show you a book cover. This is the French version, and this is the English translation version, both published by the Modern Language Association. The English translation was done by somebody you might know, an author called John Fowles, who also wrote The French Lieutenant's Woman. And he translated this story, which is an absolutely fascinating story. The author is Claire de Duras, and she told this story in her literary salon in Paris in 1823. And it was inspired by a true story. A little girl named Ourika, who was bought out of slavery in Senegal by the former governor of Senegal, the Chevalier de Boufflers. And he bought this small child just as she was about to be boarded on a slave ship. And he brought her to Paris as a gift for his aunt, the Princess de Beauvau. Okay, now there's a lot to unpack in that historical nugget. And there's a lot to be horrified by in terms of, you know, the buying and selling of humans in the slave traffic, as well as the buying of a human child for a gift. It was not unusual at this time in France to find individuals of African origins in aristocratic French households. Sometimes they were servants, sometimes they were raised, you know, as a member of the family. Sometimes they were treated as pets, and sometimes they were treated as curiosities. So, you know, this is already horrifying, but it's important that we understand the historical background of this story. So the historical Ourika lived in France until she died in 1799 of tuberculosis, and she was about 16 years old. And she was raised in this French aristocratic household alongside her benefactress's grandsons. We don't know a whole lot about her lifetime. We know these facts. And Claire de Duras learned of this story, and she imagined more details about what this little girl and this adolescent must have experienced in the course of her lifetime, growing up as an aristocrat. She told this story in 1823 and then published it in 1824. And it was pretty widely read and widely appreciated. It was read as far away as in Russia at the time. The historical person was known, and Claire de Duras' story also generated some other retellings of the story in theater. So we do have 3 or 4 versions of stage plays for Ourika, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But curiously, by the end of the 19th century, the story of Ourika sort of fades into oblivion. And it's not until maybe the late 80s, 1980s, 1990s, that this story regains the popular interest again. And right now, it's a very popular story. I use it in my French 30/20 composition and conversation class. I also use the English translation in French 1090, which is about Francophone culture. And this is a great book to use to talk about colonialism and post-colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade and so forth. So here's the fictional story. A physician is called to a convent in post-revolutionary France to treat a very ill nun. And the nun is Ourika in this historical reimagination. The doctor's narration is the one that frames the story. So we get his words and his narration first. And he frames what he's going to call a kind of a talking treatment for this nun who is suffering from what we would call depression, or what they would call in that time period melancholia. And the text then shifts to Ourika's voice, who describes what's brought her to this point. That, like her historical counterpart, she was bought out of slavery. She was brought to, in the novella, Madame de Bay's home as a gift, and she's raised alongside Madame de Bay's grandson, Charles. Early on in the story, we also get Ourika, who compares herself to Pygmalion's animated statue. Now, if you know Greek mythology, you may remember that Pygmalion was a sculptor, and he was a very arrogant sculptor, and he was arrogant about women, and he thought that in his lifetime there were no women who were worthy of his attentions, and so by God, he was going to sculpt his own version of the ideal woman. And he prayed to Venus to animate his statue, and lo and behold, his statue became his ideal woman. And so at the very beginning of this story, Ourika sees herself as a creature, as an object that is created for someone else's benefit, which is a deep insight for this young child. Now, she does describe her benefactress, Madame de Bay, as being very kind. She talks about all of the positive attention that she gets paid to her by Madame de Bay's aristocratic friends. And she also talks about the moment when she finally awakens to her difference and to what will forever isolate her in this society. That moment comes when she overhears a conversation with her benefactress, Madame de Bay, and her friend, the Marquise. And the Marquise and Madame de Bay are having what they think is a private conversation, but Ourika accidentally overhears the Marquise say to her friend, well, this is all lovely. Ourika, she's beautiful, she's talented, she's smart, but what do you intend to do with her? Clearly, she can't be married off to any aristocrat. And here's a citation from the text. The Marquise says to Madame de Bay, what kind of man would want to marry a negress? Even supposing you could bribe some fellow to father mulatto children, they could only be of low birth, or he could only be of low birth. She can only want the kind of husband who would never look at her. Now, this conversation, this overheard conversation, has a devastating effect on Ourika, and it leads to self-alienation and self-hatred. What we are reading here is the deep psychological experience of a victim of racism. And in fact, this is what many critics have said sets this novel apart, that this is the first time we have a Black protagonist with a very well-described psychological experience. So to go back to Ourika's self-alienation and self-hatred, in her narrative, she starts to look at herself physically in a different way. She describes her hands as monkey's paws. She refuses to look at her image in a mirror. She starts to fantasize about returning to Senegal and living there, but realizes that her aristocratic upbringing would leave her isolated there as well. In the text, she also talks about hearing about the abolition of slavery with the French Revolution. And so she starts to have some hope that, well, maybe this society will make a place for me. But that abolition of slavery was very, very short-lived, and in fact, the idea expressed by the French Revolution of égalité for everybody didn't quite extend to freed slaves. In fact, shortly before the French Revolution, slaves were forbidden entrance to France. And so I'll talk a little bit later about how we might explain the fact that Ourika even showed up in France, was even able to get into France. But then with the return of, or with the rise of Napoleon, we get a return to the Code Noir, which was a set of regulations published, first published in 1685 by Louis XIV, about regulations for how to treat one's slave. And the Code Noir was actually the legitimization of torture. So in any case, with the rise of Napoleon, we get the return of the Code Noir. And it's in fact around the time that Claire de Duras tells this story that the abolition movement revives in France. And that may also explain the part of the popularity of this story. Now, another historical event that the character Ourika refers to in her narration is the revolution in Saint-Domingue, which today is known by the name of Haiti. And so she hears of this revolution in Saint-Domingue, which starts to give her a little bit of hope that, well, okay, maybe, you know, if the Africans in Saint-Domingue are rebelling, you know, maybe this will change society. But then she starts to hear about reports about the killing of the white enslavers, of the white masters. And now her self-hatred deepens. Now she begins to hate herself even more, and she says, "Now I had the shame of belonging to a race of barbarous murderers." And so all of this internalized self-hatred leads to even more depression, leads to physical illness. And again, this is played against the backdrop of the revolution and its terrors. So you have all of these social terrors and social upheaving that's mirrored inside in Ourika's inner psychological experience. So at this point, the grandson Charles returns to the family home. This was Ourika's childhood companion, and so now she can resume her supportive role of constant confidant for Charles. But Charles is, of course, of an age to get married, and he's not going to be marrying Ourika. He's going to be marrying another white aristocratic young woman. And his marriage devastates Ourika. So much so that the marquise that we talked about earlier comes around for another problematic conversation, but this time it's going to be with Ourika. This time the marquise is going to insist that Ourika is making herself sick, and she wants Ourika to confide in her and tell her what's troubling her, and maybe she can help. And Ourika refuses. She's very impatient with the marquise, and now the marquise is angry. And she's going to hit Ourika where it hurts. And she's going to tell Ourika that she knows why she's so sick, and it's because she's in love with Charles. And she shocks Ourika. And of course, insinuating that Ourika is in love with Charles is, you know, this is bordering on incest. This was a child she was raised with. This is not her blood relative, but these kinds of relationships were still rather problematic. And so Ourika is absolutely shocked and humiliated and ashamed that she has made herself sick with love for Charles. The Marquise is also basically telling her that she has made two wrong actions, if you will. She's allowed herself to fall in love with Charles, and she's allowed herself to even think of bridging, of crossing that huge racial divide. What people have called miscegenation, the anxiety of miscegenation, the anxiety of interracial relationships. And so this is, kind of Ourika's original sin, if you will, loving a white man and wanting to marry him. This is the sin that drives her to seek refuge in a convent, where we meet her at the beginning of the story, and in fact, where she dies at the end of the story, as explained by the physician, whose words conclude the novella. The physician has the last word in this story. Ourika's chosen refuge in the convent may in fact reflect a recent publication in 1818, just about 5 or 6 years before the publication of his story. And it was a manuel, a religious manual, Manuel de piété à l'usage des hommes de couleur et des noirs. So a manual of piety or spirituality for men of color and for Black people. And this was prepared by Henri Grégoire. And so, of course, you can imagine, you've got this institution of slavery, you've got this religion of Christianity, where God loves everybody and everybody's equal, and everybody gets forgiven, and so on and so forth. And how do you justify, how do you explain the existence of slavery where there's a group of people who are clearly not equal? And so Henri Grégoire, who I believe was the Abbé Henri Grégoire, who was an abolitionist of the time, he tries to get around this by depicting African people at the foot of the cross. So he's trying to integrate them into the founding stories of Christianity, even as Christianity was used to validate the institution of slavery. So that's the story in a nutshell. This story is often categorized as the first psychological depiction of a Black protagonist. Now, it certainly gives readers an understanding of this concept of the divided self that was described by Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was from Martinique. He trained as a psychiatrist, and he worked in Algeria, and I believe he was there during the Algerian War. And he had a lot of, he was very moved by and very troubled by the self-alienation that he saw among some of the Algerians that he treated. And he talked about this concept of the divided self and the consequences of race, the psychological consequences of racism. Frantz Fanon also talked about how isms, if you will, intersect. So racism intersects with sexism and intersects with classism, and it's difficult sometimes to tease them apart. And indeed, we probably shouldn't. He has a passage where he talks about a warning. If you see people expressing anti-Semitic opinions or attitudes, he says, watch out, because they're coming for you next. In other words, one ism is going to provoke another ism, and one alienated group is a promise that your group will be next. So Frantz Fanon is a good author to read alongside of Ourika. And when I teach this in French 3020, and when I teach it in 1090, I like to juxtapose some of his writings alongside with this. I also like to use this story in my courses to talk a little bit about the independence of Haiti, and what that what the historical circumstances were and how it relates to the French Revolution. And I've also had students who've done some very good, consequently, have done some very good presentations on Haiti, who have explained to us very clearly that this movement of independence of Haiti is related to Haiti's current economic conditions for the following reason. France agreed to recognize the independence of Haiti, but France insisted that Haiti pay indemnity to France for the loss of income from slavery. And that is why Haiti is, in part, in such troubled economic circumstances. They have been repaying this debt and the interest on this debt for almost hundreds of years now. And so I like to use this story and its historical references to explain certain current circumstances in our global politics today. The other thing that I like to point out about this particular historical reference, the independence of Haiti, is that we have a connection in this region to one of the heroes of that revolution in Haiti. And one of the leaders of that revolution was Toussaint Louverture. And I like to tell students that we have a local jazz legend from Detroit who was named for that military leader, and that was Donald Byrd, a trumpet player. His full name was Donald Toussaint Louverture Byrd. So all of these little moments become ways of connecting this 19th century story to our region and to our current world. I also like to use Ourika's story to talk a little bit more about other individuals of African descent who lived in France during the historical Ourika's lifetime, and there were some other Africans. One of the most well known was a man by the name of Joseph de Boulogne, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, and he lived from 1745 and died in the same year as the historical Ourika, 1799. He has a very interesting story. He was born in Guadeloupe of a French father who owned a sugar plantation and a black slave mother. Please notice that this father also had a French wife. And he eventually brought his child Joseph and Joseph's Guadeloupean mother to France. Joseph was there raised as an aristocrat. He received an aristocrat's education. He learned fencing, he learned riding, and he learned music. He was a very popular and very accomplished violinist and composer. In fact, he published some of the first string quartets in France. I play with a string quartet, and we have worked on one of his quartets, and it's absolutely lovely. Now, Joseph de Boulogne also participated in the revolution in Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, but only briefly came back to France, where he died. There was an 1839 novel about his life, and there was also a play about his life. Now, what is very interesting is to compare the novel and the play's perception of how an aristocratic black man fit into this society with how this young woman Ourika fit into French society. And what's very interesting is, whereas Ourika, there is no way to imagine that Ourika could marry a white man in our novella. But somehow, by the time we get to Joseph de Boulogne's stories, we can imagine a black man winning the love of a white woman. And these plays get very complicated. There's a complicated plot where Joseph discovers he has a half brother, and he's actually in competition with the half brother for the hand of his former slave owner, who recognizes him as her emancipated slave. And Joseph and this half brother are in this competition for this woman, and there's got to be a duel, and Joseph takes the high road and refuses to fight the duel over this woman, and the woman is so impressed by his nobility that she agrees to marry him. So this is a very different set of circumstances from the possibilities that are open to Ourika in a story dating a few decades earlier. So when I teach this novella, we're looking at the plot and the typical things that we do when we study a piece of literature. But I also like to connect what we do in the classroom with what has happened with our own U.S. history and what has happened in the world around us. And certainly in our current times, I think we can find all kinds of relevant connections. But one of the connections I like to make for students, and one that typically shocks them, is that all of this anxiety of miscegenation that's expressed in Ourika has some very deep connections to our own American history. And so after we've read the story and had some discussions, I typically will introduce the case of Loving v. Virginia and the story of Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving. And this story has been made into a film recently. I haven't seen it yet, but I am looking forward to looking at it. So this couple, Mildred and Richard, lived in Virginia. She was a black woman and he was a white man. They couldn't get married in Virginia, so they went to Washington, D.C. to get married. And this was in 1958, not that long ago. They married in D.C., and then they returned to Virginia, where they were promptly arrested for an interracial marriage. They were freed on their promise to never return, to leave Virginia and never return. So about 5 years later, they're sort of hoping that, people have seen the light, and they come back to Virginia just to visit family, and they're arrested again. There was finally, the case went to the Supreme Court in 1967, and this was the case that finally determined that laws that banned interracial marriage were unconstitutional. Until that Supreme Court decision happened, 17 states in the United States still had anti-miscegenation laws. My students are rightly, typically, very shocked to learn that all of these things that are happening in this novel have all kinds of connections with us in North America and with our own history. Now, one of the other things that I do when I teach Ourika is I ask students in a writing assignment to imagine another ending for Ourika. And typically, students will imagine that she does, finally find somebody who's going to rebel against all of these social strictures and is going to marry her, and they live happily ever after. That's certainly the ending we would like to see. But even in some of the plays that were subsequently written about Ourika, that's still a difficult ending for society at that time to envision. So in about, it was the 1830s, there were a series of plays that took up the Ourika story again. And in most of these plays, the ending usually concludes with Ourika sailing back to Senegal, or with Ourika somehow saving her benefactress's grandson by either, giving him money she had saved up or an inheritance that she had saved up, and helping him get married to the white woman that he loves, and promising to be there to, watch over them. The plays can't imagine that Ourika can marry a white man. And in fact, they don't even imagine her marrying at all. Instead, they either want to ship her off to Senegal, or they want to see her as still serving her white benefactors in some fashion or other. Even as Joseph Joseph de Boulogne was imagined as being accepted by a white woman. Now, I have published on this story and on some of the subsequent plays. And in the first publication that I wrote on Ourika, I was very interested in the cover of the book. And to make my point here, I want you to take a look at the cover. And I'm going to see if I can pull up my presentation with. I have a presentation with this original painting. And I believe that is right here. And I'll see if I can share this with you. Let me see. Share content. Share a file. I'm sorry for the delay here, but I think I can get it to you pretty quickly. Almost there. It's converting and it's spinning. Are you seeing anything?
Not yet. How about sharing it as a tab if you open it on your computer, Linda? That may work easier.
As a tab?
It will convert. It just takes time with Blackboard, but it will convert.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So this this image on the cover of the book is a painting by Marie-Guillaume Benoit, I believe is her name. Get to the point in the oh, well, I'm not coming up with it, and it doesn't seem to be converting. But the original painting, it shows much more of the woman's torso, including a bare breast. And I was very interested in this comparison between the cover that the MLA chose for its edition and the original painting. And in one article, I tried to suggest that there was a deep anxiety about Black female skin, and that even the MLA had to contain it for the cover of its book. And the editor absolutely refused that passage. I had to take it out of the article if I wanted that article published. And I thought that was a pretty interesting experience, to say the least. And if we can ever get that presentation, oh, maybe it is there. Is it there? File options, remove. Okay. Are you able to see anything? I'm clicking on everything and it's not working.
Not yet.
Okay. All right. Well, we won't worry about it. Okay. So that's the story in a nutshell. That's how I use the story to talk about racial justice and racial injustice in my classes. And I do this as many of you have all been doing, and I thank you, Dwight, for organizing this series, because I think that it's good for us to know that we have in fact been addressing these issues in our courses. We can certainly do it more, but I think it's acknowledgement that we have been addressing some of these very, very important issues in our classes. And the other thing that I feel very strongly about in organizing my teaching and trying to advance learning is to make connections between what we talk about in the classroom and what's happening in the world around us, to make connections between French history and American history, that these things do not happen in isolation. They happen in intersection. French history is our history, just as our history affects European history and African history is part of our history too. And I think that this novel, this novella, is a good way to make that point with students. So let me stop there, and if there are comments, questions, observations, I'd be happy to hear them.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Rouillard. I have some questions, but before I ask any of mine, I want to let other people have a chance to ask. Any questions? Again, remember this is being recorded, so you're more than welcome to turn on your mic. If you feel shy to be recorded, you can always type your question as well. Either way works just fine. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Yeah, if I may, I'll ask a question. It seems we're talking 1824. That was the year, right, of the story,
18.
and 1920, almost 100 years. How far do you see the society, especially with the issues we're seeing nowadays, have progressed or regressed in these issues, Linda?
Well, I think we've made some progress on a superficial level. I think we certainly don't have any laws that forbid interracial marriage, but clearly our society, at least our American society, is having a horrible time understanding what equality and equity and social justice mean, and that's very disheartening. And Gabby, from what you have told me about some of your current research with refugees in Germany, for instance, I think that speaks to the same level of problem. That, I mean, you're not going to meet anybody, well, you're not going to meet too many people who are going to literally say, with the exception of white supremacists, that, one group is worth less than the other. What we do see are the everyday actions that clearly demonstrate mentally we have not yet embraced the concept of racial justice and social justice and equality. And even beyond equality are the issues of equity, the everyday inequities in our society that are based on race. There's no other way to put it. Bill, I just saw that thing in the chat box. Absolutely. And in fact, I use the Oberger's decision. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing that. I use that in some of my other work related to the medieval literature. That when you define marriage, whoever gets to define marriage has an awful lot of control. Is it going to be the church? Is it going to be government? This is a huge thing. And yes, of course, interracial marriage was just one other way of exerting that social control and determining that same-sex marriage will or will not be valid is in fact another level of that same kind of social control.
Manuel, go ahead, or Manuel, go ahead. Manuel.
Thank you. Thanks, Linda, for your presentation. And I have one question regarding the language in the novel when tackles the racial subject. Like, how does the author explicitly or implicitly names the racism? I mean, in terms of language, is there some kind of censorship or carefully written sentences that are implying racism, or is it explicit? Is it direct reference to this issue?
It's implicit. The novelist never uses the word racism, but we get it through the protagonist's experience in her own skin and her experience of her own skin. She never says that, you know, French aristocrats were racist, but she does talk about, I will never find my place in this society. Or, you know, when the revolution is happening at the beginning and there's the talk of égalité, fraternité, and liberté, you know, she says that she feels hopeful about finding her place here. But the word race is never explicitly mentioned. Skin color is explicitly mentioned.
All right, thank you.
If I may jump in, first a couple comments and then a couple questions about the author. First of all, regarding Don Bird, thank you. I never knew that about his name. And that's someone, you know, Bird, he's like on a lot of albums. If you listen to a lot of Bob, I mean, he was as a sideman, he was on everybody's album. He did a lot of his own too.
Yeah,
but I never knew that.
Him as a trumpet player.
Yeah, he's great. That's
Yeah.
really cool. So that was neat. Regarding Haitian poverty, I'll add, and I'm not a historian, but my recollection is that U.S. embargoed Haiti as well during the revolution because there was fear that the revolution would spread
Right.
to the U.S.
Right.
And that led to a long chain of events, bad relationship between Haiti and the U.S. The U.S. basically resolved by putting a strong man in power that would be friendly with the U.S., but not at all kind to Haitians. And there was a series of bad rulers who impoverished Haiti at their own benefit, and the U.S. supported them because they were friends of the U.S. And even when the U.S. finally brokered a democratic turnover of power, they did so under certain conditions that they demanded certain economic reforms in Haiti that basically left Haiti economically dependent on the U.S. And so this poverty that we see in Haiti today is no mistake. It's by design, and it's not just France. I would argue it's also, you know, U.S. had a role in that, unfortunately.
Right. Thank you for
that's,
pointing that out. Yeah.
Yeah, just my 2 cents on that.
No, it's
regarding the author, regarding the author, first of all, was it exceptional to have a female author in Europe in the early 1800s being read internationally? Second of all, was there any backlash about this book? Did anyone react negatively towards her?
Let me take the last question. There was some mockery of the story. There would be references to Ourika or Bourgeonica or those kinds of things. But the story circulated through numerous countries, and as I said, even as far as an edition that was published in Russia in French. Now, as far as women writers, there were some women writers, but of course they were not as well known. Although I have read that writers such as Goethe read this story and was fabulously impressed by it, and I believe Chateaubriand read the story and was very impressed by it as well. So of course, one of the things, you know, one of the ways that women participated in the literary culture was through salons. These places where, you know, new works were presented, works were discussed. You know, you try out a draft of your of a chapter or something. And so women sort of participated in that perhaps more than as writers at the time. But of course, you know, as my colleague Friede Emens would tell you, there are lots of women writers, it's just we don't know about them. And that's what her research has been of late, is rediscovering German women writers of the Second World War and their experiences of war, their recounting of their experiences in war. So there certainly were women writers, but and of course, you have Germaine de Stael, Madame de Stael, who is one of the precursors of the Romantic movement in literature. But you also had this cadre of women who ran these literary salons, particularly in the 18th century, and Claire de Duras, even as late as the early 19th, was also running her own literary salon.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah, and it's fascinating now that we have some ability to do this, to recover some of those old writings and try to now appreciate them, albeit a little bit late, but that is an exciting endeavor now that we're finally getting around to doing this.
I'd also like to invite the students who are here to tell me a little bit. Does this story resonate with other things that you're studying, other things that you're reading about? Do you make it a regular habit to ask yourself when you're in a class and you're doing something, you're studying a particular concept or topic, how does this relate to my other classes, my other interests?
Don't be shy, everyone. Remember, you can type in too. Do you do that? Do you draw connections between what you're learning in class and what's going on around you? Because there's a lot going on around us right now. What do people think about that? Any thoughts?
All right, I'll just go again. My name's Morgan. I'm a theater major. And something we talk about a lot of in our classes, our directing class, is looking around the world around us. So my family comes from a military background. So my cousin's in the Marines right now, and I am focusing on my final project in that class about being in a military family and relating that because I saw Trump's tweet about him making a plan to not let transgender people serve in the military. And I was very upset because everyone, no matter how they identify, has a right to serve their country. And so that is something big that we talk about a lot is what are you seeing? What knowledge are you feeding your brain? Like, are you watching a good movie? Are you listening to good music? What have you seen that interests you, what you can build on? So, yeah.
I like that concept of feeding your brain. I think we forget how important it is to furnish our brains with the things that'll sustain us through a lifetime, the interests that we need to develop, and that's what college is for, is to develop that whole set of interests and just a sense of inquiry, because that is what's going to feed your brain for the rest of your life. And we want our students to have as many opportunities to develop as many of those interests as possible.
I like that concept of feeding your brain too. That's really well said, actually. Somebody else commented, I think many of my classes are starting to focus on these kinds of issues. Yeah, I think a lot of us professors have, if we haven't been talking about this already, I think we're starting to become a little more aware ourselves and perhaps a little more vocal about these things and starting to think about how does what I teach relate to what's going on right now. So it's not just for the students. I think it's also for the faculty. This is a moment for us.
Absolutely. I also try to look at these issues of racism, sexism, classism, and American history, and always try to look for the consequences. And do I still see consequences of the Atlantic slave trade? Do I still see consequences of racism and sexism? It's it's rare. And as I said, yeah, we do have groups of white supremacists, for instance, who will, boldly declare in public, I think that, you are worth less than me because of the color of your skin. But I think those instances in our daily lives here in Toledo on this campus are rare. Instead, what we see are the vestiges, the consequences, the legacy of institutions of slavery. So it's that accumulated set of consequences of, if your family has never been able to accumulate even a little bit of wealth that can be passed on from one generation to the next, that's a serious consequence for some of our students who are first generation college students, who are trying to afford this college education, who are trying to raise families. The consequences are there facing us every day. And I think that's what we need to also make ourselves more sensitive to as we grapple with some of these issues.
I think that's really well said too, and I do think that's an ongoing process. And again, at least among us sociologists, we're still learning, right? We're still studying this. We're still figuring out how this works. And all the historical implications of what happened before us and how it plays out during our own lifetimes is something we're still understanding. I just realized my mic was off. You didn't hear me, did I? So I'm going to read. Let me try that again. Someone said, yes, I agree with that assessment. The challenge being able to distinguish what those vestiges are today. Yeah. Other comments, questions? Anyone? Someone, Paulette noted, I enjoyed your talk. I love the parallels to the United States and then moving to today. Very interesting. Yeah, I'm really impressed how you're able to take this and relate to the Loving case and even more contemporary examples. Even how you tied in Frantz Fanon. That was excellent. Very enlightening for me.
It's a good way for our students, even in French 1090, which is a culture course taught in English, to start reading some of this, some of the classic writings on race, and to start thinking about the theory related to these issues.
Yeah. You also got from Dr. Simon, thank you, Dr. Rouillard, for a very interesting presentation and the links you made. Yes, indeed. Well said. Yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, we should probably wrap up because Dr. Rouillard and I have another meeting. But I want to take this moment to thank all of you for attending. Another person said, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for sharing. Oh, by the way, there is one last question. How your students react to her fiction overall? What do they seem to enjoy or dislike the most?
They're very empathetic. They're very empathetic with the protagonist. They really feel for her, and I see that in their writing assignments when they really want to imagine a more positive ending for her. And I think that that's one of the deepest lessons that we can learn from this kind of a story is empathy. That's what leads to social change, and I think that's what will lead to social justice too.
That's an excellent comment to conclude it. Well, I have another good comment someone just typed in: with so many ways to divide people, this has been a refreshing way of bringing people together. That's a good concluding comment as well.
Well, and I'd also like to thank you, Dwight, for your organization of this, and I'd like to thank everybody who came to be part of this discussion, and I look forward to being part of some of the future discussions in this series. So it's been great to be with you today.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks, Dr. Rouillard.
My pleasure.
We'll be in touch with more presentations next week. We got a couple more lined up. So thanks everybody. Thanks again. We'll see you.
Thanks. Bye.